I never meant to become the kind of woman who tells her story in whispers, the kind you only admit in the dark when the room is quiet and everyone else is asleep. But here I am, 46 years old, a night shift nurse who spent more time under fluorescent lights than beneath the sun, trying to explain how a series of small choices turned into something I can barely name without feeling my stomach twist. If you're listening to this, imagine the hum of hospital vents, the soft beep of monitors, the shuffle of rubber soles on linoleum. That's the soundtrack of my life. For nearly 2 decades, I thought I knew exactly who I was, the calm one, the responsible one, the one who could walk into chaos and make it manageable. Then one man walked down a hallway at 2 in the morning, and suddenly the solid ground I'd built for myself felt like it was tilting very slowly under my feet. People think big disasters happen all at once. They don't. They ooze in. They drip through a crack. You're too tired to notice. They start with a conversation you tell yourself is harmless. That's how it began with him. My name is Nina. I work nights on the oncology floor of St. Bartholomew's Medical Center, a not quite big, not quite small hospital wedged between a freeway overpass and a sleepy strip of late-night diners. I started on days when I was young enough to believe coffee was optional. Back then I had a husband, a daughter in elementary school, and a life that followed the usual rhythms: school pickups, grocery lists, weekend barbecues, arguments about nothing that felt like something. Now my daughter is in college 2 states away, my ex-husband lives with his new wife and their toddler, and I work the graveyard shift where the world feels slightly off, as if the colors have been turned down and all the edges are a little blurred. Nights in oncology are quiet in a way that never feels truly peaceful. The hallways are dimmed, but never dark. Machines breathe for people whose bodies are forgetting how. Sometimes the saddest sound you hear is nothing at all, just the eerie stillness of a room where the family went home to sleep because the doctors said there wouldn't be any news until morning. I always thought I was good at separating my life from my work. You have to if you want to last. There's a kind of mental door you learn to close when you leave at dawn. You hang up your badge, scrub your hands so hard they redden, and pretend as you walk to your car under the pallid sky that you weren't holding someone's hand as they cried only minutes before. Dark hair that curled just enough at the nape to look unintentional, stubble like he'd started shaving that morning and then forgotten about it. He wore a white visitor's badge on his jacket, the name Gabriel L. scribbled in rushed pen across it. Room 414 was Miranda's room. Every floor has a few patients whose names everyone knows, not because their cases are dramatic, but because they stay. Weeks turn into months, and their rooms transform into little shrines of normal life, photographs taped to walls, colorful blankets from home, cards with glitter that never quite vacuums out of the corners. They become part of the scenery in a way that's both comforting and heartbreaking, like seeing the same tree every day on your walk and knowing one day it will be gone. Miranda had been with us for almost 4 months. 36 years old, metastatic breast cancer that had spread to her bones and liver. A school teacher. Her friends came during visiting hours and filled the room with laughter, but nights were usually reserved for one person, her husband, Gabriel. I'd seen his name on the chart, but until that night I'd never seen him in person. My schedule usually had me on the opposite side of the floor. But staffing had been shuffled, and here I was, stepping into their orbit. He was so still that for a moment I thought he hadn't heard me approach. The monitor blinked softly in the background, Miranda's oxygen line whispering with each breath. Her hair, barely there now, clung to her scalp in soft tufts. Her face had that waxy paleness I'd come to recognize, the kind that told me things the doctors hadn't yet put into words. "You must be Gabriel," I said softly, so as not to startle him. He turned his head. His eyes were the first thing I really noticed, a strange kind of blue, not bright, not dull, just watchful. The kind of eyes that made you feel like he was taking in more than you wanted anyone to see. "Yes," he said. His voice was low, a little hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. "You're the night nurse?" I nodded. "I'm Nina. I'll be taking care of Miranda tonight." He glanced back at his wife and gave a slight nod, as if I'd told him something less important than the weather. I stepped closer to the bed, scanning the monitors, checking the IV lines, doing the things my hands knew how to do even while my mind was somewhere else. "How is she?" he asked quietly. It was the question every family member asked, even when they knew the answer. Often it was less about the information and more about needing someone to say out loud what they were trying not to think. "She's stable right now," I replied. I gave the familiar, measured words that walked the tightrope between honesty and hope. "Her pain seems well controlled. She was resting when I checked her earlier." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "She's always resting now." I hesitated. There's an invisible line between empathy and intrusion. I've spent years trying to stay on the right side of it. That night, I probably stood closer to the edge than usual. Maybe I already felt something shifting, without knowing its shape. Night can be harder, I said. For everyone, how are you holding up? He looked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard the question correctly. People don't always ask how the family is. We should, but we don't. We're busy, we're tired, we tell ourselves it's not our place. I'm fine, he said after a moment, the automatic answer. Then he added almost too quietly, I don't know who I am without something to do. I understood that more than he knew. That would be good, he said. So I showed him. Simple things. How to hold her hand without disturbing the IV line, how to smooth the blanket so it wouldn't bunch under her heels. He moved carefully as if afraid he'd break her, this woman who used to be a whirlwind of movement if the photos around her bed were anything to go by. After a while, I stepped back, watching him. He wasn't the man I'd expected. I'd imagined anger, restlessness, maybe denial. Instead, there was a quiet intensity about him. He listened to every instruction like it was sacred. He thanked me more softly than most people did. The rest of the night, I caught glimpses of him through the window of 414. Sometimes he would be sitting in the chair, elbows on knees, head bowed. Sometimes he stood, hands on the rail of her bed, lips moving as if he were talking to her, though I couldn't hear the words. Once, around 3 a.m, I saw him rise, press his forehead gently against her hand, and stay there for a long time. I told myself the strange little pull I felt in my chest was nothing more than professional concern. Compassion, the kind nurses pride themselves on cultivating. I was wrong. He started coming more often after that. Not just in the evenings like before, but late at night too. He'd show up around midnight after spending hours at home trying and failing to sleep, or so he told me one night when the hallway was empty and we leaned against opposite sides of the doorframe. You could try staying home, I suggested once, not because I wanted him to, but because it seemed like what a sensible nurse should say. Get some rest. You can't pour from an empty cup. He gave me a faint smile. I can't sleep in that apartment alone. Everything in it feels like it belongs to someone who doesn't exist anymore. He gestured toward Miranda's room. This feels more real somehow. He had a way of speaking that made ordinary sentences feel heavy. The more nights we crossed paths, the more I found myself slowing down near 414, lingering just a little longer than necessary when I checked Miranda's vitals. We developed a rhythm. I'd ask about his day, he'd ask about mine. He always looked surprised when I told him I was divorced. I'm not sure why. Maybe he'd assumed that a woman who spends her nights caring for dying people must have someone waiting at home to anchor her. I remember the first time he made me laugh. Truly laugh, the kind that shakes something loose inside you. It was around 2 a.m. The floor had settled into that strange, suspended quiet where time feels thicker than usual. I had just finished helping a patient in 420 who'd been throwing up relentlessly despite our best efforts. I felt wrung out, shoulders tight, my ponytail falling apart. I stopped by 414 to check Miranda's pain pump. Gabriel sat in the chair, notebook open on his lap, pen resting loosely in his fingers. You look like someone just asked you to run a marathon in laid shoes, he said. 12-hour shift, I replied with a shrug. Night 6 in a row. I'd probably lose to a toddler in a race right now. He tilted his head thoughtfully. Depends on the toddler. Some of them are terrifyingly fast. For some reason, the way he said it, so dry and unexpected, made me suddenly snort with laughter. A ridiculous, undignified sound that startled us both. I clapped a hand over my mouth. Sorry, I murmured, still half laughing. Inappropriate nurse reaction. It's the sleep deprivation. No, he said. It's good to hear someone laugh in here. He smiled, and it wasn't the faint, brittle thing I'd seen before. It was warmer, real. It made him look younger, the lines around his eyes melting into something softer. I walked out of that room with my chest feeling strangely light, and for hours after, I caught myself replaying that moment, the way his eyes had lit up. I told myself it was just nice to see a family member cope with humor instead of anger or tears. I told myself it was normal to feel a little more invested in some families than others. Human, even. Every rationalization I made in those weeks came wrapped in that comforting word, human. That's what we tell ourselves when we begin to drift. Time in oncology has its own language. You stop thinking in days and start thinking in scans. We'll see after the next scan. Let's wait to see what the imaging shows. The scan becomes a kind of god, its decrees written in grayscale shadows on a screen. Miranda's next scan was worse. I was there the night the attending came in with the results. I stood by the doorway as the doctor sat down and explained in gentle, rehearsed phrases that the chemotherapy wasn't working anymore, that they were shifting focus from curative to comfort, that terrible, vague word that means, in essence, we can save you, but we can try not to let you suffer too much as you go. Miranda listened with a calm that unnerved me. Gabriel didn't. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists where they rested on his knees. I watched the muscles in his forearms tense and release like he was fighting some instinct, to shout, to overturn the chair, to leap up and make a scene. But he didn't. He just nodded slowly, as if the air in the room had turned to syrup and movement took too much effort. After the doctor left, I stepped inside to check Miranda's drip. She looked at me with eyes that were both tired and oddly clear. "How long?" she asked quietly. "In your opinion, I won't hold you to it, just your gut." It's a cruel thing that after a while you develop a sense for these things. You can see it in their color, the way they breathe, the way their body sits under the sheets. I thought about her lab values, about the progression in her chart. "Months," I said softly, "not days, but probably not a year." I hesitated, then added, "I'm so sorry." She nodded, unsurprised. I figured. Gabriel stared at the floor, his lips pressed together, a tiny muscle jumping in his cheek. I wished for a moment that I could split myself in two and comfort them both separately, tailor my words perfectly to each. Instead, I stood there, a single flawed human, feeling painfully insufficient. "I'm going to fill out some paperwork," Miranda murmured after a moment. "Advance directives, that sort of thing. I'd like to talk to the social worker." "I can arrange that," I said. Later that night, when she'd fallen into a medication-heavy sleep and the floor had quieted again, I found Gabriel standing by the window, staring out at the city lights that glittered beyond the parking lot. "So that's it," he said when he heard me behind him. "We're just waiting for her to die now." His voice didn't break. That almost made it worse. "We're going to keep her comfortable," I said quietly. The words felt inadequate as I said them. "We're still here. She's not alone in this." He laughed, a rough, broken sound. "You've probably said that 1,000,000 times. "I have," I admitted, "to a lot of families, but it doesn't make it less true." He looked at me then, really. Looked, and something passed between us that I didn't have a name for, a kind of recognition. Like he'd just realized I wasn't only a uniform, and I just realized he wasn't only the husband in 414. "You must see people at their worst," he said, "angry, scared, selfish, all the stuff we try to hide in normal life." "Yes," I replied, "but I also see them at their most honest." He studied my face. "And what about you? Do you ever get to be honest, or do you just keep being professional?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth, closed it, laughed weakly. "I'm usually too tired to figure out what honesty would even look like," I said. He smiled faintly. "That sounds like something someone says when they're very, very good at not thinking about themselves." "What about you?" I countered, more defensive than I meant to sound. "You come here every night instead of sleeping. That doesn't sound like someone who's honest with himself either." He leaned against the windowsill, folding his arms. "Maybe I'm just afraid of what will happen when I don't have this to do anymore." This, sitting by her bed, talking to her even when she's too drugged to answer, adjusting her pillows because it makes me feel like I'm still useful. He looked at the dark glass. His reflection stared back at him. What does a husband become when there's no wife to care for? The quiet vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to say something comforting, something wise. Instead, I whispered the first truth that came to mind. "Lonely," I said. "He becomes lonely. At least that's what happened to me when I stopped being a wife." Silence stretched between us, a thread that didn't feel empty. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, distant and fading. Inside, the monitor in Miranda's room beeped steadily, indifferent to our confessions. That was the first night he asked me about my life. It began casually, the way these things do. He asked how long I'd worked at the hospital. I told him. He asked if I'd always been on nights. I explained how I'd switched after my divorce to make the schedule work with my daughter's school back when she still lived at home. "What about now?" he asked. "You could go back to days, right?" "I could," I said, "but nights pay more, and they make it easier not to notice how empty my apartment feels." There it was, spoken aloud for the first time to a stranger. I felt weirdly exposed, as if I'd shown him a scar I usually kept hidden under clothes. He nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." We talked in fragments that night, while I charted, while he sat by Miranda's bed. The conversation never went deep enough to feel inappropriate, but it also didn't stay shallow. It hovered in that in-between place where two people start to let their guard down without realizing it. From then on, I noticed when his name appeared on the visitor log. I noticed the way my heart lifted, just a little, when I saw his jacket tossed over the chair in 414 or his notebook open on the side table. I told myself I was just glad Miranda had such devoted support. A good nurse cares about that. A good nurse values family presence. The trouble is, I wasn't just a nurse. I was also a woman. A lonely one. I didn't set out to blur those lines. No one ever does. It happened slowly. Cup of coffee from the vending machine I brought him at 1 in the morning when he looked particularly worn out. "Tastes like regret," I warned him. He drank it anyway. A joke he told me about a disastrous attempt to cook dinner the week before, how he'd burned the garlic and set off the smoke alarm. I laughed, pictured him in a kitchen full of smoke, waving a dish towel at the ceiling. The first time he said my name without the nurse attached to it. "Nina, can I ask you something?" Not nurse, not ma'am, not excuse me, just Nina. I heard it echoing later in my head when I tried to sleep. The first boundary I knowingly crossed was small, almost invisible. It was a night like any other, at least on the surface. Miranda had been more awake that evening, a rare window of clarity between medication doses. We chatted briefly about my daughter, about her students, about the strange, intimate world of online teaching during her earlier treatments. She'd fallen asleep around midnight, her breathing soft and even. Gabriel stood near the door, tension radiating off him. "You can stay," I told him. "We'll dim the lights. There's a blanket in the cupboard." He shook his head. "I have to go home for a bit. There are bills I keep ignoring, laundry, stupid things like that." He rubbed his eyes. "If I don't do them now, they'll bury me later." I nodded. "That makes sense." He hesitated, then said, "Would you call me if anything changes? I know you will anyway. He trailed off, embarrassed. "Of course," I said. "You're listed as her primary contact." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Can I get your name, full name I mean, so I know who I'm talking to when someone calls?" I hesitated. It was a reasonable request. Families often ask for names, but usually I pointed at my badge. "Nina Alvarez," I said. "That's me." He typed it into his notes app, along with the hospital's main number. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If you ever need to reach me directly." He scribbled his personal number on the corner of a folded visitor information brochure and held it out to me. "Just in case, I keep my phone on all night." My fingers brushed his as I took the paper. A tiny, pointless contact. That a few texts didn't mean anything. But if it meant nothing, why did I feel a rush every time my phone buzzed with his name after that? The weeks that followed were a strange blend of routine and escalation. At work, I saw him nearly every night. At home, on the mornings I couldn't fall asleep right away, we sometimes exchanged messages that stretched well past what could be called necessary. He told me about his old life in bits and pieces, how he and Miranda met in a photography class, how they'd saved for years to take a trip to Spain only for her to be diagnosed a month before their flight, how the unpaid bills stacked up on their kitchen table like a second, quieter sickness. I told him in careful slices about my own life, about my daughter, Lola, and how we mostly communicated through scattered texts and occasional video calls now, about my marriage that had slowly eroded under the grind of my shifts and my ex-husband's resentment. "You weren't home enough," Gabriel said one night, reading between the lines. "That's what he said," I replied. "He wanted a wife who could come to dinner parties and weekend getaways. I was busy trying to keep people alive." "And now," Gabriel asked, "do you regret choosing this? Every time I lose someone," I said, "I wish I'd chosen something easier. But when I help someone die without screaming, when I see their face relax because they're not in pain anymore, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He looked at me thoughtfully. "You talk about death with more peace than most people talk about their jobs." "When you work nights," I said, "you see all the things people thought they had time for and never did. It rewires your sense of what matters." "And what matters to you?" he asked. The question hung in the air. I could have answered with something generic, health, family, stability. Instead, I heard myself saying quietly, "Honesty and connection, I guess. Real connection, the kind that doesn't feel like you're just saying your lines in some play you didn't audition for." His gaze didn't leave my face. "Do you feel that here with me?" I wasn't ready for that. The floor shifted under my feet. He listened, he nodded, and when the doctor left, he sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed against his temples. I stood there with my chart in my hand, feeling useless. There's no medication for the moment someone truly understands they are going to lose the person they love. No dosage that makes that realization any less lethal. "Do you want some water?" I asked, because it's what we say when we don't know what to say. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet, but no tears fell. "No, thank you." I stayed a moment longer, checking lines that didn't need checking, adjusting pillows that were already fine. I didn't want to leave him alone with his thoughts. "Nina," he said suddenly, voice low, "I'm scared I'll say the wrong thing and she'll remember that instead of all the good years." I moved closer, the chart pressing against my chest. "I've seen a lot of people at the end," I said gently. "They don't remember exact words. They remember how they felt, safe, loved. You can't ruin that with one clumsy sentence." He swallowed hard. "What if I can't be what she needs? What if I fail her?" "You won't," I replied. "You're here. That's more than a lot of people manage, honestly." Something in him broke at that. He drew in a shaky breath, and for the first time since I'd met him, tears actually spilled over. He pressed his fingers to his eyes like he was embarrassed by them.